We've all seen really bad branded podcasts where they come out and they're just not good. It's either one giant sales pitch or it's just bad information. How can you avoid that? That's what we're going to talk about this week, as well as we have some podcast news in terms of how advertising works with smaller podcasts. Stay tuned. Thanks for tuning in. I'm really excited about this week because we get to dive into the branded podcast piece of this, which is what we help so many people do. It's all about elevating the voices, things of that nature. So I'm really excited to get into some of this because this is gonna step back to some of the things that everyone really needs to look at. Before we get into it, I got a few housekeeping items. The one biggest thing is obviously make sure you're subscribed. Helps us out a ton. If you have a question, put it in the comments. We want to hear from you. Also, we're thinking about getting a couple of communities going. We're finally to that point where we feel like this would be beneficial to everyone. And we're going to talk about that in branded podcasts later. But with that, where would you like to see us? Would you want to see something Facebook? Do you want to see it just through like an email group? Or do you want to see it through like a Discord group? Where would you like to have a group where you could talk with others? With that being said, let's dive right into making sure that your branded podcast isn't going to fall flat, that it's going to deliver the right message, and that you're really going to make sure that this is going to be effective marketing for you, but not come across too markety. Is that a word? I don't know. Either way, the first thing that we have to talk about here is this is back to the basics. Define your brand's educational niche. We talked about like the riches are in the niches last week and stuff like that. And they are. We need to define where you excel in educating people, because as a branded podcast, this truly is all about educating people. We want to make sure that you are trying to talk to the right people. Now in that, it's making sure that you're talking to the right people in the right way. You don't try and teach 8th grade science to 4th graders. In the same sense, you don't talk about motorcycles to people that like knitting. Different things here. So we want to make sure, don't try and be everything to everyone, because you won't be. You will get lost in the shuffle. What we want to do is we want to make sure that you have picked not only your specific person that you're talking to, but we want to make sure that you have picked the educational pieces that you're going to talk about. One of the podcasts, I'm going to refer to the Late to Grid podcast here. They've done a great job of saying, look, we are here to help people get into motorsports, to help them accelerate that journey. We've all started something and we've started from ground zero. They do a great job of introducing people and topics that are questions for people that are just starting out. What that does is that allows you to really pick your exact audience. And what they do is that supports their shop, Atomic Autosports. So once again, are they looking for a NASCAR race team to come in? No. That's not their client. Are they looking for someone that's just getting into motorsports and maybe starting with some basic like track days that's just going to do it with their street car? They don't even have a race car. That is the people that they're looking to help. So that is exactly who they talk to in their podcast. They give that specific knowledge, that specific expertise, and they call on specific people that have that knowledge and expertise as guests. They also do a good job of making sure that their unique value proposition is put forward, that they are kind of that one-stop shop if you're looking to get into this. And it could be, I mean, they aren't just the basics. They go well past that. But by covering the basics, they've now brought someone into their ecosystem and they can start to grow that. Now, one of the things that I want to say when I tell you to pick your specific people, if you try to talk to everyone, everyone talks about gaming the algorithm. There's no gaming the algorithm. The algorithm is going to do what it's going to do. What happens is when you pick your specific people that you want to talk to, the algorithm will find the people that want to hear that message. It takes a little while because it's matching your preferences with someone else's preferences with someone else's preferences. But once it starts to get that map laid out, it really does a good job of presenting the information to the people that actually want to hear it. So, like I said, define your brand's educational space. That is exactly where you need to be. Now, the other thing that you can do in that is you want to develop some content pillars that are consistent. So those are offering that consistent value to everyone. And there's a couple of things that you guys hear me talk about all the time. Making sure you're in the right niche. You've narrowed it down so you're talking to the right person. Making sure you're educational. Those are some of our content pillars. That is what we stick with. That is where we excel at. It's those core themes that you want to talk about. I don't want to say always come back to those specific things because you don't want to be a broken record. You want to be presenting new information. But you can talk about the nuance of that information. You can talk about something adjacent to that and how it supports it. It's that structure that's going to provide that consistent content that people are going to come back for. As I mentioned, we've redone our podcast just because of the fact I noticed pod creep. We started getting out of the area where we normally, where we excelled at it, and that was talking about these branded podcasts and talking about the educational piece in that. We kind of lost track of those pillars, and that's why I really want to hammer on this. Always kind of have those. I mean, I've actually got them written down in a sheet that we use when we start working on constructing these topics. Does it cover this? Does it cover this? And does it cover this? Because those are the things that we want to make sure that we're covering week after week after week after week for you. Once again, there's nuance for it. And we want to make sure that, we're giving you good new material, but make sure that we are sticking in those exact lanes. The other thing that I want to talk about with educational storytelling is another huge thing. So weave your brand's message into like stories, case studies, client testimonials, things of that nature. That's what's going to make this engaging and memorable rather than just me up here prophesizing or whatever you want to call it. It's those types of stories that allow you to connect. And that's why we talk about like Atomic Autosports. That's why we talk about like Coach Woody from Next Better with some of the things. That's why we talk about like the Better Business podcast. It's those types of things where we're bringing you into those stories and we're engaging with those stories. So first off, you can see them in action. You know that it's something that's tried and true. It's not just me tossing information out there. The other thing is as kids, I get it. Everyone hated story problems in math. But in the same sense, when you can see that something is applied and you can see where and how it is applied, that can make a world of difference in how you apply that to your own podcast and your own information. I've always said there's new ideas out there, but those new ideas are typically related to something that's already going on. And that's very much the case here. And that's why we talk about these things. We want you to be able to pull something that's related and kind of bring that over into your world. How does that adapt for your specific podcast? Because it's not going to look the same. But another podcast we work with is the Call It Like I See It podcast. And I love this. James Keyes on there told me the one time, he goes, history does not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And that to me is a quote that I've used constantly. I love it. I believe it was Mark Twain that said that, but James is the one that told me that one. And to me, it totally makes sense. Your podcast is going to be your individual podcast. So it shouldn't be someone else's podcast, but it may kind of rhyme with someone else's podcast is what we're going with. As an educational piece, one of the things that I always talk about, and this is the one that you guys know, offer value. Someone is taking the time to sit down and watch your video or listen to your podcast. I cannot stress this enough. Make sure that you are delivering something to make their time worth it. Think about high value people, what their hourly rate is for something. If let's say it's someone that's in charge of a company, millions of dollars hinge on their decisions and their time. If someone like that is giving you 10 minutes of their time, make it worth it. Make it those experiences, make it make it that education. This is also the other piece to this is the fact that is how you create that and that's why we go with the educational piece on this. If you are teaching people about your industry, if you are teaching people about things that are going on, if you are instructing people on how your product or how your service does things and what the benefits are to them and all of that, that's that value piece. It's why we do this podcast. I'm making sure that I'm offering value. We're talking to you about how you can increase the visibility and the viability of your branded podcast. That's what we're making sure we're doing is we're adding that value for it. Another way you can do that is you can get those guest experts and industry insights. I've got a few guests that we're still talking to. We are going to have some guests coming on here in the next few weeks. But really, these relevant experts, they can share their knowledge and perspectives with you. There's so many benefits, and we've talked about this kind of ad nauseum. But really, if you effectively work with them, their social media will help you because they can put some of the clips and that out on social media, on their social media. They'll share stuff. You can tag them. You can collaborate with them. All those things will make sure that you can work with them on that. Not only that, but once again, they're going to have their specific niche. You should have yours. But if they can talk about something that is in your corner, but they can talk very, very specifically about it, it's a huge win because once again, you're offering value, you're educating people. The example that I would give to this is when you say doctor and you think medical profession. Okay, everyone has their general practitioner. But if something's really going sideways, they're going to refer you to a specialist. And that's how you should think about any experts that you have on your podcast. I don't want to tell anyone to be a generalist, but to talk about a specific thing. But if you know of someone that has studied and done a very specific thing, bring them on. That's that's your heart surgeon, that's your brain surgeon, that's your gastroenterologist. Very, very specialized people. I probably don't want my general practitioner operating on my brain. I do want him to recommend a brain surgeon to me, though. Think about it that way with it. Something else that it does, too, is you're often going to get different insights from them. You're going to get different viewpoints from them. You're going to get items that you just didn't think of. Branded podcasts, repurposing for social media. That's how you're going to dominate the space. That really, truly is. Design your episodes with social media in mind. It's what we're doing. We're making sure that we are setting up questions and we're setting up items so that way we're going to get a 30-second to 90-second clip out of this that's going to go out that you're going to see in shorts, you're going to see in Instagram Reels, you're going to see in those places. These clips are designed to do that. That's how we speak like this. In that's what's going to get you a lot of visibility. Now, you have to make sure that it works in this circular fashion. So someone's going to see you on Instagram. They're going to be like, oh, that they're interesting. They're going to find your podcast. So they're either going to find that on YouTube or through your RSS feed. Once you have them there, now you've got to make sure that you get them subscribed. Maybe you get them into your newsletter. This is this circular flow of things where, like I said, the podcast is a great way to use social media to bring people into your ecosystem as long as you've engineered your podcast to do that. So make sure you're asking questions that are probably going to have that 30 to 90 second sharp answer. Those are the things that we really want to look forward to in that. Something else, we've talked about this all the time. You need a consistent schedule. Make sure that people know that, hey, I'm going to show up every week or every 2 weeks. That every 2 weeks is still a great schedule. Every week, if you can do it, holy cow, that's absolutely amazing. But make sure you are showing up consistently for people. There are podcasts that I literally, like Monday and Wednesday morning, I wake up and I look over at my phone and I'm like, yep, they're there. Awesome. I can listen to it while I work out or while I walk or whatever I'm doing. I can listen to those podcasts. I know they're going to be there. I know they're showing up every single week for me. That's huge. What I would equate it to is, let's say you're expecting a delivery of something. You get a delivery of widgets every single week on Tuesday and you sell widgets. What happens if they don't show up till Wednesday? Or what happens if they just don't show up? You're kind of bummed. You feel kind of betrayed. It's the same thing with a podcast. That's how you're going to make that connection. The same side of it, we always talk, make sure it's a high quality production. Does it need to be in the studio here? No. Do you need to make sure that you've got decent lighting, that you've got a decent sound? We've talked about that. People will tune out bad audio like that. Make sure that you sound good. Make sure that you look decent. Make sure that you're active in this. If I sat here and talked like I was a robot, you guys would probably tune into something else. So make sure that you've got that high quality production, not only from a camera standpoint, but from the way you look and the way you interact with people. Speaking of interacting, interactive engagement is huge. We want to encourage people to participate through question and answer segments. We're working on a live program, so that way you can go live and you can talk directly with your people. Awesome, awesome, awesome way to do things. Polls, contests. We've had great luck working with a few people with contests. You give away a t-shirt. People will tag you and stuff for a t-shirt. T-shirts aren't all that expensive. Send it out to someone. It works really, really well. The other thing I would say is create that sense of community. We talked in the beginning, I'm looking to see if we want to do a Discord or a Facebook community or anything like that. We want to be able to bring some people together. So that way, as you guys are working through your branded podcast, you can talk about this stuff. If you've got a question, I mean, there's so many podcast communities that we're involved in where we see people ask questions. And other members of the community are helping them out and engaging with them. This is what we're seeing. That's what we're seeing. It works really, really well. It's that commonality. Everyone's listening to the same thing, at least probably once a week. If you all got that same base to build off of, there's already that connection there. Now, this is where it gets tricky in your branded podcast, is you want to have strategic calls to action. I want to call this a bit of a soft sell. You don't want to say, hey, look, we've talked about this for 20 minutes. This is the best stuff ever, so you need to order it now. That's not how you want to approach this. You want to integrate those subtle calls to action, whether it's you can have them download a free resource, but from that, you're going to get their email address. You can have them join your online community. Once again, I talked about that with our Discord and Facebook questions. Make sure you let me know in the comments on that. The other thing is, like, we do our 30-minute no-pitch podcast consultation. It's a way to engage with people. It's that call to action. It's that soft sell. When we get people on our no-pitch podcast consultation, which I still always have a tough time saying, but nonetheless, when we get people on that, I show up. I am truly there to help. The number of people that say, hey, you know what, we want your help over the extended period of time is huge. If you show up genuinely interested in helping people, it shows. And that's a huge part of why I do the podcast here. I want to make sure that your branded podcast goes well. Keeping with these items, these rules, like I said, if you keep track of these types of pieces and look at them as you're writing out your questions or as you're writing out your script or as you're approaching your guests, this will play out huge for you in the long run. Now, with that, that's all branded podcast stuff. We've got a news piece this week that I think you're going to find very interesting because it's going to talk about the advertising. There's a study that was just done that talks about the advertising and how it changes depending on the size of the podcast. With that, I will be back in just a moment. We'll get into the news. In the news this week, PodScribe's quarterly dive into podcast ads revealed that smaller podcasts achieve greater efficiency in ad performance. This is really cool to me because there's a couple of reasons with this. If you're monetizing your podcast with ads, that's kind of a boost. If your podcast is a branded podcast, does that sound familiar? Have we recently been talking about branded? I believe we've been talking about branded podcasts. If you're a branded podcast, boy, does that resonate. So the big thing is smaller podcasts typically have a more targeted niche. They are stuck in this corner. They handle these people. It's very direct. It's very tight. If you go to, let's say, advertise on, let's say, Mel Robbins, or let's say Diary of a CEO, or Lex Free, any one of those big podcasts, huge audience. Now, you may engage with you may be in front of 3 million people. How many of those people actually care about your product? That is always the big question. So once again, this kind of turns into that social media thing where they're like, hey, we got a bunch of likes on this, or we got, it always drives me nuts when they're like, our reach was like 11,000 views on this. Great. How many people engaged with it? How many people actually cared about it? To me, that is the biggest question. So with this, a smaller show, you're going to get a higher engagement with that ad because there's that direct relationship between the topic and the people. Let's talk about a specific style of knitting. I referred to knitting earlier. I know absolutely nothing about knitting. I know there's a number of different stitches, and I know there's a number of different things that people can do. Let's say it's people that like to knit in a tight stitch and make red sweaters. No problem. If you talk to people, like if you're selling red yarn, holy cow, is that the right audience for you? If it's just a general show about knitting, if you sell red yarn, are you going to hit some people in there? Sure. If you're advertising in that show, I guess it would say, are you going to hit some people in there? Sure. Is that a majority of your audience? Probably not. And that's the big thing about it. So you may be paying for 3 million views, but how many of those 3 million people actually really cared? Where if it's a show about knitting red sweaters, if they get 1,000 people that watch and or listen to that show, guess what? All 1,000 of them are going to care. You're probably going to have a lower cost per person because it's much more effective. So therefore, your cost per customer acquisition cost in that, as an advertiser, is less expensive. This holds true for that branded podcast also. Because once again, I always tell people when we're setting stuff up with them, do not expect to get 3 million listeners. That's not why you're doing this as a branded podcast. You're doing this as supportive material to make sure that you are getting your message out directly to the people that it actually matters. We would all love to have 3 million customers, but you have to realize that's just not the case with this. You have a direct audience that you're talking to. Make sure that you're talking to them. One of the other things that I love about this too is it's authentic. If a red yarn company advertises on a red sweater knitting podcast, guess what? They're truly, going to support that. As the host, if you talk about that's really going to carry, hey, I only use red sheep yarn. Once again, this is, there's that connection there. There's that know, like, and trust that's really going to grab people. It's authentic, I guess is what I'm trying to say, is because there's that much better of a connection. The other thing that I want to talk about is the data behind that. When you go to a big podcast, like I said, if you're going to toss your ad out for 3 million people, are all 3 million people engaged with that? Probably not. Is the percentage of people engaged with that lower than with the red sweater knitting podcast? Yes. You get a much better idea of what you're paying for as an advertiser. Now, in a branded podcast, you have a much better idea of who's actually engaging with it. If you've got this, we never want to say you want the smallest audience possible. That's not the case. You do want the most engaged audience possible. So when it comes to that branding piece of that, make sure that you've got that engagement there and realize that 1,000 people that are just totally engaged and just watching front to back are much better than 1 million people that are kind of meh. Maybe they're going to hang around for it. The other thing I want to talk about too is with the smaller podcasts, they often will have, if you're going to advertise on any one of them, they're going to have that creative flexibility. They're going to have that ability to do the host-read podcast, the host-read ad, dynamic insertion. They're going to be more flexible with how that's done instead of having to have this specific byline or guideline or branding guide that you have to fit in as an advertiser. Now, how do we adapt that information over to your branded podcast? Well, really, it's making sure that you find creative ways to put your message in there. Because once again, with that smaller, tighter audience, they're going to be paying attention. So you're going to want to make sure that you've got that messaging that's going to get directly to those people. The advantage you have in that is you know who those people are. When you're talking to that 3 million people, you know who the 3 million people are, but it's a broad audience. You have to talk to just your people in that audience. So therefore, you're limiting that down. Therefore, you can see this tumbling effect of diminishing returns. To me, the biggest piece that came out of this study that I saw that I absolutely loved is that with branded podcasts and these tighter niche podcasts, you're going to get that much better engagement and you're going to get those much better results because of that. And really, this is all results driven, right? That's why you're starting a branded podcast. Next week, once again, great topics. I haven't worked that out yet. So I really would love to hear what you would like to hear us cover. That being said, do me a favor, take care of yourself. And if you can, take care of someone else too. I will see you very, very soon.